Welcome to the reading of Guide's Greatest Hero Stories. This is Chapter 9, Just Like Frank, by Doris B. Colligan, January 26, 1972. During all of Ray Brown's 14 years, he had heard the same question. Why can't you be more like Frank? Ray adored his 22-year-old brother, who had recently gone into the army. But try as he would, he could never come up to Frank's reputation. Ray was all thumbs and kept bumping into things. When he tried to fix something, it turned out worse than when he'd started. Oh, if you were only more like Frank, his exasperated parents would say. Ray wasn't outstanding in school. He always passed, but with no brilliant marks. He was a plugger. While things had always come easily to Frank. When he didn't understand some of his schoolwork, teachers who taught Frank a few years earlier would say, "Why can't you be more like your brother Frank?" But with all his faults, Ray kept trying. Sometimes he would run errands or do favours for the neighbours. They were always polite to him, but Ray imagined they were saying, "Why aren't you more like your brother?" Sometimes Ray thought even Frank's dog, Rex, didn't think he was much good. He would never mind Ray and would answer his call when he was good and ready. Even Rex was probably thinking, "Why can't you be more like my master?" There was a guy. Ray had taken over the paper route that Frank had once had. He was sometimes slow in his deliveries, but he made up for this by being extra careful to put the papers where the wind or playful puppies couldn't destroy them. All his accounts were good, except for Mrs. Marshall. He used to put in the money for her and sometimes made several trips to her home before she had the proper change. He became well acquainted both with Mrs. Marshall and a little 3-year-old Jimmy. Mrs. Marshall, a newcomer to town and 300 miles away from her former home, was happy to talk to Ray. Her husband was overseas with 3 more months in the military service before he could return. Also, Mrs. Marshall was one of the few people who hadn't known Frank, so she never compared Ray to his older brother. One day, Ray found Mrs. Marshall upset. She told him she needed to go to the hospital right away, for her second baby was due. Her mother couldn't arrive in town for several hours yet. "What shall I do about Jimmy?" Mrs. Marshall worried. "Don't you mind about Jimmy, Mrs. Marshall," Ray said. "I'll take him home with me until your mother comes. You just go ahead and call a taxi. I'll wait here until it arrives." Jimmy, who was fond of Ray, was excited at the prospect of going home with him, so he didn't even make a fuss when his mother went away in the taxi. He was just in a hurry to get to Ray's house and have Ray play with him. Ray's surprised mother was very understanding about the little guest Ray had brought home. She acted as if it were the most usual thing in the world for him to take care of a 3-year-old. She made a quick decision. "I don't believe Mrs. Marshall should be alone at the hospital. If I stay with her until her mother arrives, do you think you could get supper for Dad and Jimmy?" Ray was very sure he could. he decided to make pancakes and fried eggs and have some ice cream for dessert. Both his dad and little Jimmy praised the supper. Good, Jimmy said with appreciation. A chef from the Waldorf couldn't have done better, Mr. Brown added. Ray smiled proudly, recalling he hadn't spilled or dropped a single thing. I guess I was so busy that I forgot to think what Frank might have done, he thought to himself. Jimmy helped Ray clear the table, and they all did the dishes together. Ray kept Jimmy playing cars until Mrs. Brown came home. A lovely, older edition of Mrs. Marshall came home with Ray's mother. She was Mrs. Marshall's mother, Mrs. Graves. So this is the young man who has been so helpful to my daughter, Mrs. Graves beamed. My daughter wanted me to tell you she has a beautiful little sister for Jimmy. I'll take him off your hands now. I don't know what we would have done without you. Ray was really pleased with the unaccustomed praise. Maybe, he thought, I can find other things to do so folks won't keep comparing me to Frank. He decided he would begin right away by taking some of the profits from his newspaper route to send some flowers to Mrs. Marshall. He picked out a pretty dish garden to send her at the hospital. When Mrs. Brown learned about this, she said, Why, son, what a thoughtful thing to do. I kept thinking about her husband so far away and her being a stranger, Ray said. I thought she wouldn't be getting many flowers. You seem so grown up all of a sudden, Ray's mother said, giving him a big hug. I'm trying to be just like Frank, Ray admitted. Just keep on being like Ray, his mother replied, with a smile.